Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics and in the wake of the role social media in particular has played in not only inciting but helping to organise the recent far-right riots. There's a discussion about whether our laws are good enough to deal with the problem, and the discussion is generally coming to the conclusion, no, they're not. However, there are a couple of tricky things to consider. So, Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, first of all suggested, I think yesterday, the government should look at whether the Online Safety Act needs reviewing. He doesn't think it's fit for purpose. Being clear, a lot of people, both tech experts and legal experts, said that the legislation passed by the Conservatives last year was not really all that suitable. Yes, it contained some useful tools, but it also created weaknesses in the form of unachievable requirements and some areas where it failed to come up with protections at all. And in response to Khan's intervention, the government have said, yes, indeed, they are going to be looking at the legislation as a matter of urgency to review whether it's really good enough. I think there's an assumption on the part of the government at the moment that it's not quite there. However, there are some things to consider. So Paul Mason, who's a prominent Labour commentator, has argued what the government should do in terms of the urgency is implement the provisions with the Act right now. Because one of the problems we have is the Online Safety Act, although it's passed into law, it's sort of come a bit late because even for the bits that are useful, because when you pass legislation, like if there's going to be far-reaching consequences for like stakeholders, regulators, affected businesses and so on, you have an implementation period. You give people time to understand what the law is demanding of them and then to work on putting policies in place so they're ready when the law comes into effect. So with the Online Safety Act, some of the provisions don't actually become law until 2025 and with other ones in 2026. So Mason's saying, look, sod that, we've got an emergency, amend the Act to put them in place right now. For example, one thing the law does, which is not currently implemented, is allow Ofcom to fine social media companies fairly hefty sums if they don't do enough to tackle terrorism or incitement to violence on their platforms. So bring it in now so we can start applying those sanctions. Makes sense. Except problem. Actually, there's probably several problems, but a big obvious one is Ofcom isn't even ready. After the legislation was passed, it then began the task of working out, so how can they use these new laws in a practical sense? Because it's not just social media companies who've got to then implement policies to make sure they're acting within the law. The regulator has to work out an action plan on how it can use that law. It's no good if Ofcom starts making things up as it goes along, because all that will do is invite legal challenges and you end up in a mess. Really, the main reason we find ourselves in this position is the government, or successive governments, have failed to keep pace with technology. Governments of all political parties tend to do that because they're advised by people who don't use it and don't understand it. So we saw the rise of social media into this massive influential entity whilst being stuck with legislation that was passed in the mid-1980s. And the internet was not really a part of most people's lives, and social media platforms really didn't exist. We took too long to catch up. Then we got hit by a major emergency before we were ready. However, there's also the political messaging to consider as well. Although the government have said, look, they are going to urgently review whether further legislation is needed in order to regulate social media, what they can't allow is a message to get out there that there's some hole in the current legislation. Like when Cabinet Minister Nick Thomas-Symonds was answering questions about this today, and he said, Khan was right to highlight the policy challenge. He also made the point that people inciting violence online now or organising violence online now are breaking current laws. And that is important for the government. They don't want to talk about updating laws while this emergency is going on because that might give mixed messages to the public. People may think, oh, it's not illegal right now, I can get away with it. So they need to understand that actually there are already laws in place to hold those who organise or encourage violence to account. If you allow people to think the law isn't really working for social media, that it's still a bit of a Wild West, they may think they can still get away with it for now. Which is why the news of arrests of people who have shared disinformation online about the Southport attacks and also people who've been organising violence online, that is important. Get that message out there. These people have been arrested, therefore the current laws must be okay for it. Obviously, we don't know that for certain until they've been convicted. But it's important to get that message across because, that people have been charged for these offences. And because there's nothing to be done in terms of changing the legislation in time to deal with the urgent matter right now, there's no point in having too much of a discussion about it. From the government's point of view, I can. deal with the emergency, but then look at the legislation again and make it better. And that will need dealing with urgently, because you do still need that implementation period for anything big. You have to give organisations who have to comply with new laws a reasonable amount of time to review and adapt those policies. Otherwise, you're just setting them up to fail. And you have to give your own regulator the time to do the same, or you're just going to end up losing court cases and costing the taxpayer more money and not actually enforcing anything. It's like they say, you can do things quickly or you can do them right. The reason for the urgency is we did not keep a legislative eye on social media for too many years because politicians don't understand it or the potential pitfalls if it's not properly regulated. It has been like the Wild West. But the government also have a massive issue to deal with, and which is a particular issue, which is Twitter. See, other social media platforms have shown signs of responding. People point out Telegram and TikTok, I think a lot of people would miss TikTok. Maybe we don't miss Telegram so much as a country if that was to be completely obliterated. But they've been used by the right as well, but they also showed signs of doing something to tackle the problem. Whether it was enough, I'm not qualified to say. It's the same with Facebook, but they did something. Twitter did nothing. Twitter's owner actually pushed the disinformation himself. He amplified the calls for violence, and he continues to do so. One thing that this review is going to have to consider is, what do you do about a completely rogue social media platform, which is unlikely to respond to the usual penalties? Because the usual penalties are financial. You're regulating private businesses, so hitting their profits, usually a good way to get them to think twice. But what if you're dealing with an organisation that doesn't run a business model? Twitter wasn't exactly profitable before Musk took it over, but revenues have crashed through the floor since he bought it. So what money it was making, it's not really making anymore. And he continues to make decisions that attract less and less revenue. How do you manage that? Applying financial penalties doesn't really seem like it's going to work. In fact, such is the business model of Twitter, you might almost wonder if applying a financial penalty based on profits might actually mean we have to pay them. That's going to be a big part of the review, which will certainly have to take place urgently after this summer. Cannot make the same mistakes the Tories did. It can't err on the side of free speech, but against the freedom to live in peace. This isn't America. Here, the UK is more like the rest of Europe. We understand that the freedom to live without fear of attack or intimidation is more important than someone else's freedom to talk shit. After all, there's nothing stopping you saying what you want in private. There's your free speech. Secondly, we must understand that it is not just social media that's the problem. For years, our mainstream media, including the BBC, has normalised hate speech. There was no counter to politicians and others making objectively false statements about immigration or multiculturalism. There was also a noticeable lack of voices speaking up in favour of both of these things being platformed. If the government wants to stop something like this happening again in the future, there is going to be an urgent need to review the legislation, not with a narrow focus just on social media platforms, all platforms that have a role in influencing public opinion. And because a comprehensive review will take time, and because legislation will take time, because there'll be a lot of debates in Parliament about it, and because you also need an implementation period, the sooner this process starts, the better. Because as it is, even if the government get their approach right now, it won't be in place for years. And even if they do get the approach right now, what is just as important is recognising that it has to be constantly reviewed, because things will keep moving on. Take account of changes. We've basically waited 40 years before updating legislation on this, which is insane. We should have an automatic review every so many years, whatever that be, 5, 10 years. The government always have the option of making changes sooner if something pops up to demand their attention between reviews. But don't allow legislation to gather dust for decades just because no emergency occurred as a result. You can't wait for politicians to realise there's a problem, because by the time a politician realises the problem, it's too late. That was the case here. Finally, worth just mentioning a comment piece I saw flash up in The Guardian this lunchtime. Made me laugh. Headline, social media is a problem, Keir, but so is life for too many people in Britain. I'd deal with that first. And you think to yourself, yeah, this is absolutely right in terms of ultimately what has been feeding this anti-immigration, anti-multiculturalism has been lowering of standards of living. And these people have been told the reason your standard of living is lower is because of immigrants or something else like this. But I thought to myself when I saw the headline, Is this how low the Tories in government set the bar? That even people with thinking skills, because, they're writing in a national newspaper, they're used to the government only being able to do one thing at a time. Oh, well, if it's a choice between this and this, we should do this first. It's no, government's made up of 100 ministers. That means government is doing at least 100 different things all at the same time. And as each minister usually oversees more than one policy development at any one time, actually government's realistically doing hundreds of things at any one time. Yes, we destroy the arguments against immigration if we improve people's standard of living, but that's for the Treasury, the Department for Health and Social Care, the Department for Housing and Communities, the Department for Work and Pensions. The Department for Culture and Media, I'm not sure they've got a massive role in that, if I'm honest. So why don't we say that maybe their job is bringing media outlets into line with standards of decency? Because government can do lots of things at once and needs to. We've just, until recently, had one that didn't want to do anything. But that has changed. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.